A rabbi was once auditioning in a shul, and he was preparing to give his sermon, and the president comes over to him, and the president tells him, Rabbi, strictly no longer than 5 minutes. Absolutely, 5 minutes. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of the joke or story, no more than 5 minutes. Okay, he's under strict instructions from the president, but which rabbi can keep a speech under 5 minutes? So he's thinking quickly. He gets up at the lectern and he says, before I speak, I'd just like to say a few words. And he proceeds to give a 20-minute speech. So just before we start, just a couple of introductions. Firstly, I like to always share why I chose this topic, and I'll just, in case you didn't see it, I'll just reiterate the topic that we're going to speak about is about the kashrus and the potential issues with oakberry, which we'll explain what that is in a moment, and Boost juices, and then broadening it a little bit to vegan establishments in general. So one of the reasons why I chose this topic is because it is something that's, I guess, a little bit gray, or we'll discuss soon why to me it seems a little bit gray, and people kind of threw out phrases and catchphrases. It is kosher, it's not kosher, there's no problem, there is a problem. So I wanted to see for myself what exactly, to know for myself. I don't like catchphrases often, and I should look into it more. You know, the famous Melbourne-Sydney controversy with the Slurpees, not everyone knows. There was a really good article a couple of years ago, or maybe last year, by Ephraim Baskin in the Young Yeshiva magazine, where he actually explained it all really well. So I like seeing things for myself. That's the first reason why I chose this topic. The second reason why I chose this topic is that, and I don't know if this was mentioned in the other shiurim, this year, Tovshin Pehei 5785, is exactly 50 years since the Rebbe launched Mivsa Kashrus. The Rebbe launched Mivsa Kashrus and other Mivsaim, Mivsa Taras HaMishpacha, in Tovshin Lamed Hey in 1975. And I thought it'd be appropriate just to quote a little bit of the Sikha. This is from Tes Zayin Tammuz, Tovshin Lamed Hey, where the Rebbe launched Mivsa Kashrus. And the Rebbe opens up the Sikha and says there are two reasons why today, more than ever before, and this is 50 years ago, why today, more than ever before, people are struggling with Yiddishkeit. There are more and more people that are struggling. And the Rebbe says, number one, because there's a lack of care, or people not keeping Taras HaMishpacha properly. And secondly, the Rebbe says, kashrus. People are not being so meticulous and careful about kashrus. And the Rebbe says that it's explained in Sfarim, and not just Jewish Sfarim, even in secular Sfarim, how much of an impact food has on a person, both physically. We know that food, if you have unhealthy food, you'll feel unhealthy, etc., etc. People are going on diets and very careful about what they eat. And more than just begashmi, it's not just physically because the food becomes part of you, but also baruchni. Spiritually, the food that you eat has a big impact on a person. And this is not just brought in Chassidus. The Ramah and the Ramban, the Rishonim, the Ramban was a Rishon, and the Ramah who wrote the Shulchan Aruch for the Ashkenazim, say that when one eats an animal that eats other animals, they inherit those characteristics. So they themselves will attack others, maybe not physically, but they'll attack them verbally, etc. This is brought by Rishonim, before we even go to Chassidus. And how much more so, Chassidus tells us that you are what you eat. That when we eat something, it has a major impact on us. And the Rebbe says if someone eats non-kosher, or they're not so careful about the kashrus, it will have a major impact on their, I'll say it in Yiddish, on their edelkeit and reinkeit, on their refinement and cleanliness and purity, on their Jewish seichel. And even if a person was born, Baruch Hashem, with Taras HaMishpacha, if they're not careful about kashrus, it can have a major impact. And the Rebbe says the Rebbe's talking, actually, this was a sikha to the women, when the women are careful with kashrus, not only it will affect their entire house when they're very careful about it, and everyone in their household will be careful about kashrus. And when everyone in their household is going to be careful in kashrus, it's going to affect their body and soul, and it will make the entire world pure. And when that happens, this will bring Mashiach. So the Rebbe says it's all a domino effect. When we're careful about kashrus, ultimately that will bring to Mashiach. So I thought it was very appropriate to give a shir on kashrus, even though I anyways like giving a shir on kashrus, since it's 50 years exactly from this Tammuz since the Rebbe launched this. A bit of a disclaimer, as I always make this disclaimer, that although we will draw conclusions, it's not just a pilpul, but please don't paskin based on this. You should speak to your local Orthodox rabbi. I always say that in the classroom, and my students say, so why are we even learning this? And there's no point. I think there still is a point. I believe in what I researched, but nonetheless, there's always different circumstances and always depending on the person and the place. So we'll start with the first main topic, which is Oakberry and Boost. So for those that don't know, there is a food chain store called Oakberry. It's across Australia. It's in Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland, in South Australia. I don't know about Western Australia or the Northern Territory. And it sells smoothies. Smoothies, fruit, acai, mainly acai. Acai is a type of berry, which I only heard about when I went to when I heard about Oakberry. And they zoom up fruit and they serve it to you with granola, with fruit cut up on top. There's one on Ackland Street and one on Chapel Street. Those are the ones that are in this area. Boost juice you can find in Melbourne Central, in the airport. There, you can Google it. They're in a lot of places, and they blend together vegetables and fruit. It's very natural, apparently very healthy as well. So, Boost juice has no kosher certification, to the best of my knowledge. Oakberry does have kosher certification from the KA, which is the Sydney Kashrus. So I found it interesting that the Oakberries here were under the Sydney Kashrus, and people have asked Kosher Australia, and they're kind of given iffy. I don't know if there's anything official out there. I don't want to get in trouble, being recorded. I did speak to Mr. Weisbord a little bit, and I'll share what he said in a moment, but I decided let's explore it a little bit ourselves so we can at least know what to ask, make our own decisions somewhat, or know what to ask the rabbi, or know what to ask Kosher Australia. So, the first issue, and actually when I spoke to Mr. Weisbord about 2 weeks ago, and I said, what's the story with Oakberry? He said, well, they serve milk. So the first issue is that they do, as part of your smoothie, you can have milk in the smoothie, and the milk is not tempo milk, it's not Chalav Yisrael. And in fact, if you ask Oakberry for their kosher certificate from the KA, that it is mentioned explicitly on the sheet that the milk is not, although it's kosher, it's not Chalav Yisrael. So if one is careful about Chalav Yisrael, and Rabbi Dickstein a few days ago, maybe it was Friday I think, gave a share on why Chalav Yisrael is so important. So if one is careful about that, one has to ensure, number one, not to ask for milk and make sure there's no milk or yogurt inside his smoothie. Another concern could be, well, they're washing all the dishes together, so you have the milk, the previous cups or the previous dishes which were all used for milk. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because we did discuss it last year, but just a very quick refresher why that shouldn't be an issue is because if it's washed together in a sink, usually sinks legally, actually, they can't reach a certain temperature. They can't be too hot, otherwise it gets dangerous. And the water, there are a number of opinions, but the water needs to be at least 45 degrees to transfer taste. So even if you did have some milchik dishes and you had a cup or a spoon that was used with yogurt which wasn't Chalav Yisrael, together with other dishes which may be used to prepare your smoothie, it probably wouldn't be an issue because it's not hot enough to transfer. Now, even if they used a dishwasher, and a dishwasher can certainly reach the heat that can transfer taste, as we discussed last year, most dishwashers, hopefully, you would presume, use soap, and therefore that becomes noisen tam lefgam, which we're not going to go into now for lack of time, and we have done it in the past, where very briefly it gives a disgusting taste, and therefore it won't transfer, it won't become an issue in the dishes that you're using for your drink, even though milk is transferring because it's gross, it won't I don't want to use the word prohibit because the milk is kosher, but it won't make your dishes a problem. Aside from other issues, aside from other solutions which we discussed on Shavuos, which is in a dishwasher, it's probably bottle b'shishim. There's so much water, there's so much dishes, the milk is nullified, and I believe it was Ramosha says that a dishwasher in general might be a cliche, so it's not hot enough to transfer. So in terms of the milk, and I did confirm this with Mr. Weisball from Kosher Australia, as long as you don't request milk in your smoothie or yogurt in your smoothie, that shouldn't really be an issue. So what then is the issue? Why do we even need kosher certification? All the ingredients are fruits and vegetables, right? Fruits and vegetables are kosher internationally. You don't need a hechsher on fruits and vegetables. Not in Eretz Yisrael. So, the only issue with fruits and vegetables, which I never really looked into, which made me very excited to research this, is tolaim, is bugs. Bugs. We know that, of course, fruits and vegetables are kosher, but many times in various fruits and vegetables, it can be infested with all sorts of bugs. Bugs are not kosher. Not only that, when you eat a bug, the Gemara says in Makos, on Daf Tazayin on base, that when you eat one bug, when you eat a nemola, you actually are chayiv in 5 malkuyos. You actually transgress 5 negative commandments by this one act of eating a bug, 5 negative commandments in the Torah, as we're going to delineate in a moment. But before I just jumped a little bit, I want to just always like knowing, we mentioned it before, the rabbi giving a sermon, I always like knowing where we're going, so we're not in the dark. So we're going to divide this first section up into 6 parts. We're going to start talking about the prohibition against eating or forbidding eating bugs. We're going to mention the source and how strict it is. We're going to talk about the obligation to check for bugs and when you need to check for bugs. We're going to talk about, thirdly, how hard you have to look for the bugs. The 4th point we're going to discuss, and I'll explain it then, is about misasik. Can we consider it misasik? And I'll explain what that means when we get there. The 5th point is going to be specifically about the smoothie and bugs becoming nullified. And then the 6th point, we're going to talk about how the bugs change and how it's going to be nowadays and how it's going to be depending on location and where you live. And then as a 7th point, we'll just wrap it up and try to give a conclusion. And then we'll move on to a little bit more broad vegan establishments in general. So, let's go to the Mokar, the source. In Parashat Shmini and Vayikra and Perik Yud Aleph, I'll just read through it very, very quickly. The Torah says 5 times, don't eat bugs. It says, Al tashaksu es nafshoiseichem b'chol asher etz hashoretz. It says, V'loi sitamu bohem, don't make yourself impure with them. Thirdly, it says, V'chol asher etz hashoretz al oretz sheketu lo yochel. Fourthly, Kol hoilech al gochoin lo yisoichlum, don't eat it. And the 5th pasuk is, V'loi sitamu es nafshoiseichem b'chol asher etz haremes al oretz. 5 lavin. 1 bug, 5 lavin. How many averos? There's so many averos that you transgress, and you only transgress 1 negative commandment. Here, by eating a bug, it's 5. Therefore, because of the severity of eating bugs, the Shulchan Aruch says, and the Gemara says, you're required to check. When you have produce, you have to check, are there bugs? The Shach in Siman Pei Daled says that if there's a lot of bugs, it's actually a biblical obligation. Not like many times where the rabbis, wanting to safeguard us from prohibition, said, be on the safe side, check. Here the Shach says if there's a lot of bugs, the Torah requires you to check your produce. When do you need to check your produce? Do you need to check all your produce? So the Shulchan Aruch says in Siman Pei Daled Sif Ches that if there's a concern of infestation, you have to check for bugs. If there is, in the Hebrew words the Shulchan Aruch uses, is a miut hamotzoi. A miut hamotzoi, which translates loosely as a minority which is found. Even if there's a minority found, we are concerned that there'll be bugs, and therefore you have to check. What is that minority? So of course, as with many things in halacha, it's a machlokes. The Shailos HaTshuvos of the Rivosh says a miut hamotzoi, a minority which is found, is closer to 50%. And it's not going to be 50% because we said it's a minority, but it's got to be up there. The word to use is korov lemechsa, close to 50%. If something, a produce, let's say lettuce, is usually almost 50% of the time infested, you'll have to check it for bugs. If not, if only 10%, 20% infested, then you won't have to check it. The Mishkados Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Bruchin, says, and this will be most important because most people paskin like him, says only if the produce is 10% infested. If 10% of the produce is infested, then you have to check it, and you have an obligation to check it for bugs. Where does he pull out the number 10%? So those that are doing Sefer HaMitzvahs or are studying 3 chapters of Rambam every day, we had this quite recently. When someone purchases 100 barrels of wine, so I think today it's not so common, only if you get homemade wine. I know my grandfather, Rabbi Gorelik, used to get the wine from Aaron Faglin that it does happen to that type of wine. Today, because of the preservatives, it doesn't happen so much. But the halacha says, the Gemara says, if you purchase 100 barrels of wine, you accept upon yourself that 10 of them are probably going to be vinegar. It's probably going to, wine, if it goes bad and there's no preservatives, it turns into vinegar. So 10 is probably going to be vinegar, and you can't have any tinus, you can't go back for a refund, because that's life. 10% is going to be vinegar. Yet, the Shulchan Aruch says that when one is separating truma to give to the kohen, and he has all these barrels of wine in his storehouse. He's out in the field and he's harvesting his grapes, he's making wine, and he says, okay, this wine that I have with me in the field, I'm separating truma, the barrels that I have in my storehouse at home, they are going to be the truma for this wine that I'm making right now. Halacha says you have an obligation to check, to go back home and check that the barrels in your storehouse haven't turned into vinegar. Because if they did turn into vinegar, you cannot use them, they're not kosher to be used for truma. Says the Mishkanas Yaakov, you see over here an interesting thing. We expect only 10% of barrels of wine to turn into vinegar. Yet, despite the fact that only 10% is going to turn into vinegar, you have an obligation to check that it didn't turn, or it did, or it didn't turn into vinegar. And therefore, he draws a proof from here that even if there's a 10% chance, or 10% of produce is infested, you have an obligation to check it for bugs. The Shevet HaLevi, Reb Shmuel Levi Vosner, who didn't pass away too long ago, said it's not about percentage, rather it's about does most produce have a little bit infested. If most produce, most lettuces have a little bit of infestation, you have to check it. Rabbi Yashiv says, and some kashrus agencies bring this, that even less than 10%, even if there's a little bit of infestation, you found a bug once, you have to already check it. So despite all these opinions, most kashrus, as we mentioned, most kashrus agencies paskin like the Mishkanas Yaakov and say only if there's a 10% infestation, then you have to check. If there's less than a 10% infestation, you don't need to check your produce for bugs. Now the question is 10% of what? So here also there's a number of opinions. How do you measure 10%? Is it 10% of produce worldwide? If 10% of strawberries worldwide is infested, we have to check. Is it 10% of Australian produce? Is it 10% of what you buy in the store? So Rabbi Yashiv says it's the amount that you usually buy. If you go to Kohl's and you usually buy two containers of strawberries, if 10% of those strawberries are infested, then you have to check. If not, then not. The Shevet HaLevi says it depends on how much you check. If you check lots in one go, it goes by 10% of that. Rabbi Moshe Heinemann says it goes by the portion served. If you usually serve only 10 strawberries, if one of those strawberries is infested, you have to check. If not, then you don't need to check. So, before we move on, let's just summarize. We spoke about the severity of the prohibition against eating bugs, and therefore Shulchan Aruch says, and the Shach wants to suggest that if there's a lot of bugs, it will be a biblical obligation. You have to check your produce for bugs. When do you have to check your produce for bugs? We had a number of opinions. The opinion that we're going to go with, and most kashrus agencies go with, is if it's 10% infested. If it's 10% infested, what is it 10% of? So we brought a number of opinions. I didn't see one specific way to go, so I wanted to conclude about that as well, but I couldn't find exactly which way we go. But the amount that you buy or you check, a small amount is definitely not of worldwide produce, then it needs to be checked. What if you can't see the bugs? I was sitting in Kollel the other day and I was discussing, and we'll get more into this soon, about strawberries, because I was at the Rara dinner, and I think it was Shoshi Lowy that catered, and they had signs. So sometimes you go to weddings or bar mitzvahs and they have signs and they say that the meat at this event is from Solomon's Kosher Butcher or from this Kosher Butcher. This was a first for me. I went to the dinner and they had signs. I have a photo. We don't have a projector. I didn't set up a projector, but I could show you afterwards. It says the strawberries at this event are under Kosher Australia, which I thought was remarkable. And that's because Adas, they don't eat strawberries. Anyway, I was sitting in Kollel and I was discussing it because I was preparing. I was discussing with someone that davens in Adas, and I was just sharing with him that happens to be, I've never seen, and this is not a proof, but I've never seen a bug in strawberries. And he said he also never saw bugs in strawberries, and then his friend showed him, he took a little tweezers and he took one of those yellow dots on the strawberries that looks like the regular dots, and he picked it up and it had these little legs that were squirming. So yeah, this shear is not for the faint-hearted. I apologize in advance. So what if you can't see it? What if you don't see the bug? You look at the vegetable and it seems like it's pretty clean. So the Sefer Abris Reb Pinchas Eliyahu Horowitz, he takes a very stringent approach, and he says you gotta take a microscope. He doesn't use those words, but he said that in vinegar apparently there's lots of very, very small bugs which you can't see, but they're there, and therefore he says you cannot just buy vinegar and use it in your salad or use it in whatever you're making. You have to boil it up and strain it, and only then, when we can be assured, because it's been boiled and all the bugs are dead and you strained it, then you can have the vinegar. You don't see the bugs, but they're there. But Rav Avraham Danzig, the Binas Adam, argues with him, and he uses quite strong terminology. He says that opinion is hevel, it doesn't make any sense. He says we should have a halach in Shulchan Aruch then, that if you want to drink vinegar, you have to boil it. He says the Torah prohibits a nazir from having vinegar, only a nazir. It should have said, the Torah shouldn't have said chometz yayin, that a nazir shouldn't have. It should have said every single person can't have vinegar, but the Torah didn't say that. And him and the Aruch HaShulchan or Moshe all say that the Torah wasn't given to malachim. And there's a meme going around, an AI-generated picture about Hanukkah of all these people at the market looking at donuts with magnifying glasses, making fun, like we do for Estrogen, we do it for donuts as well, but you don't have a chiyuv to take a magnifying glass or take a microscope and start looking for bugs. The Shevet Levi wants to go so far, and he says that let's say you decided to take a microscope, or you had a magnifying glass lying around and you saw a bug through the magnifying glass. He said, I don't know why you'd want to, but he said go ahead and you can eat that bug. It's completely mutter, even though you know it's a bug, because the Torah was not given to malachim. The Torah relies on our regular eyesight. If you need glasses, fine, you'll use glasses, but those bugs that you can't see with regular sight are mutter, and you may actually eat them. Now, what if you see black marks? So Kosher Australia says unless the black marks are moving, you don't need to inspect them closer, even though there's a black mark, maybe it's a bug. If it's not moving and it doesn't look obviously like a bug, it's going to be okay. So just to conclude that third point, aside from the stringent opinion of Reb Pinchas Horowitz, one does not have to take a microscope or look too closely. He has to look properly, but he doesn't have to take a magnifying glass and inspect the bugs. Okay, the fourth point is about misasik. So there's a concept in Hilchos Shabbos specifically where if a person does a malacha in a way of misasik. What does misasik means? He wasn't intending to do that malacha. He was intending to do something else, and by mistake it happened. Right? If you by mistake hit the light, you weren't intending to touch the light, but you hit the light. So when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, you are not going to be obligated for such a malacha. It's learnt out from the Mishkan. It says Melechas Machashavos. You have to intend to do a malacha. If you don't intend, you're going to be potter. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who was a famous Baal Musar, asked the following question, and he sent it around in his times. And he said, why do we need to check for bugs? No one, I don't think there's anyone in this room that's intending to eat bugs or wants to eat bugs. On the contrary. Therefore, he says, if you're not trying to eat bugs, you're just trying to eat your lettuce or your strawberries, why do you have to check? It's misasik. You are eating. Okay, if there's a bug eaten, it's like by Shabbos. You weren't intending to do such a thing. The Minchas Silas, Reb David Tevel Tzvi Zaman, agrees with him. And he says, yeah, I think you're right. Unless you're intending to eat the bugs, you'd be able to eat lettuce without checking it because you're just trying to eat lettuce. However, there are many others that argue with him. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says it's still an Aveira, and you do have to check even though you weren't intending to do so. The Imrei Bino says that at the end of the day, it's entering your body. Right? This is not like Shabbos where it's all about your intention. The bug here entered your body and you've eaten something which is prohibited. Rabbi Osher Weiss, who is still living, Baruch Hashem, and he's a contemporary, he's one of the big poskim out today, he says, he differentiates between bugs and other isurim where, for example, if you mistakenly, without intending to do so, you ate some fat, there you're getting benefit from the fat. But if I told someone here, oh, there was actually a bug on your strawberry, they'd want to throw up, right? It's not something that you had benefit from. And therefore, he says, maybe you can say it's misasik, but he concludes and he says it'd be very difficult to say that it's misasik. You're basically throwing away all the simonim and Shulchan Aruch that say you have to check for bugs, and therefore he says you definitely need to check. Rav Moshe Sternbach, who Rabbi Jax mentioned the other day, his story, he says after all said and done, and I think this is 10 times true, after learning a little bit of Chassidus, you can find these heterim. Yeah, maybe it was misasik. But as we started off with, food makes such an impact on us. So even if you found a heter, you're ingesting a bug which is not kosher. And it can make a major impact on a person. So he says, you can play around here and there, but that forbidden bug is going to have an impact on a person, and therefore a person should be very careful. So just to wrap up the fourth point, we discussed potentially, and some want to say, the Minchas wants to say, if you're not intending to eat the bugs, it may be okay. And if it's okay, then you don't have to check. However, most people say that it still will be a problem. Okay, this brings us to point number 5, and this is especially relevant when it comes to oakberry and boost juice. The Shulchan Aruch says in Hilchos Taruvos in Yeridei Siman Kuf that a beria, which is a living creature, and in our case it's a bug, is not nullified in 60. Many things are nullified in 60, like the famous case if a drop of milk, if a drop of milk falls into a pot of chicken soup and it's a tiny drop of milk and it's a massive pot of chicken soup, you can still have that chicken soup because it's nullified. However, there are a few exceptions to this. I teach halacha in high school here in yeshiva, and we go through various kashrus things, and we're talking about various things. The boys always say, it's fine, it's bottle b'shishim, it's nullified in 60, it's nullified in 60. So I have to tell them many times that even though, yes, a lot of things are nullified in 60, there are many exceptions. One of those exceptions is if it's a living creature, if it's a creature on its own, and in our case a bug, then even if there's thousands, right, it's a tiny bug and it fell into a massive pot, it's not going to be bottled and you'll have to throw out the entire pot. However, if it's no longer a full creature, if it's been blended and it's now, without getting too graphic, and it's now not a full creature, then it can become bottle. So if you go to oakberry and they're blending together all these fruit, hopefully there won't be any full bugs. In which case, it's most likely, if it's not nullified in 60, it's really gross. So hopefully we can hope that there's going to be 60 times the amount of bugs, and therefore perhaps we don't have to worry and we don't have to check any of the fruit which they are blending up. However, Shulchan Aruch says, Ein mevatlin isur lechatchila. We know that although, yes, prohibitions become nullified in 60, you can't intend to do that. You can't start making chicken soup now with a little bit of milk because there's 60 times the amount. If milk fell into it, we're not going to tell you to throw it out, but you certainly can't put milk in there lechatchila. Therefore, when it comes to oakberry, can we knowingly go to the store and ask them to blend up fruit if we know, and we'll discuss soon, that even if they did check it, non-Jews can't be trusted to check produce? Can we ask them? So in Yeridei, the Shulchan Aruch says that if you have honey, which a bunch of ants fell into, you're allowed to warm it up or heat it up until it all becomes melted and the bugs become melted as well, and then you'll filter it and it's going to be fine. And the Shach says there's no problem of being mevatel isur lechatchila because you're not trying to be mevatel the isur, you're not trying to get rid of the bugs, you are trying to boil up the honey. Similarly, in the next sif, when they're talking about infested wheat, if wheat becomes infested, you're able to crush it up. And again, the Shach says, even though, yes, you may be crushing up the bugs, that's not your intention. They asked Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef, who's Rabbi Yosef's son, someone asked him, and it's printed, all these juice companies, they make orange juice, strawberry juice, etc., and they just crush them all. They're not checking the strawberries. How is that allowed? Are we allowed to go and buy orange juice and strawberry juice and blackcurrant juice and all these juices if they're not checking all the fruit? And he paskin, then he says, yes, you can buy them. And he brings 4 reasons, or 4, we call them in halacha tzirufim, 4 things where if we combine them together, it will generate a heter. He says that, in general, biblically, min ha-Torah, chad b'trei bottle. You don't need 60 times to nullify something. If you have just 2 times the amount of the isur, if you had a bug and you had heter, you had a little bit of smoothie, just a little bit, as big as 2 bugs, that would already be fine. That would be considered nullified. And the whole bottle b'shishim is a rabbinical requirement, and therefore, since it's a rabbinical requirement, we're always going to be lenient. Chol b'derabbanan hochel lahakel. He also brings the opinion of Rabbeinu Shimshon and the Rashba, who were Rishonim, who says that a beria, even though we mentioned before, a living creature doesn't become nullified, They hold that it does, and it becomes nullified in 960. If they have 960 times the amount of this bag, it will become bottle. He brings a third point, that the Isav to Paskins, that a bag is nullified shaloi b'mino, which means in things which are not its type. So if it's not with other bugs, if it's in a smoothie, it will become nullified. And his fourth point is, he says, because a bug is such a disgusting thing, it's pogum be'etzem, it's disgusting, no one wants to eat a bug, therefore it's got to be fine. So, although ein mevatlin issa lechatchila, and you can't have the intention to nullify a bug, when we go to Oakberry, if anyone goes to Oakberry or Boost Juice and they're asking the person to make a smoothie for them, the intention of the person that's making the smoothie is not to nullify the bug. In fact, they're probably unaware that there's even a prohibition against bugs, and they've washed the produce and they're just crushing it up for you. And therefore, even though, yes, you wouldn't be able to crush it up without checking it first, because you as a Jew have an obligation to check for bugs, because somebody else is doing it and they don't have the intention to be mevatel, that would be fine. So if you go to Oakberry, and I did mention this to Mr. Weisborn and he agreed, if you go to Oakberry and you say, can I have a smoothie with strawberries and oranges, etc., and they blend it together, it's now become nullified. The bug is no longer together, if there was a bug, and it's become bottle. It wasn't done for you, it wasn't done for it was done for you, but it wasn't done for that purpose, and therefore it would be fine. The Chazon Ish brings up an interesting question, which will hopefully not make you too squirmy, and he says, even without blending it, when a person eats a strawberry or they eat lettuce, so if there were a bug, it's now being blended by your teeth. And therefore, he wants to say that any time you eat lettuce and strawberries, etc., it's always going to be bottled, because as soon as it comes into your mouth, it's already all crushed up and pulverized. So Rabbi Uriel Eisenthal, who wrote the Megillah Sefer, he says that certainly can't be the case. Otherwise, all the exceptions of Shulchan Aruch fall away. There is a concept in Shulchan Aruch that a chaticha re'ul iskabed, a piece of meat, a nice piece that you would serve at a meal, if it becomes it's never nullified. Why isn't it nullified? Because it's a very chosh of a thing. It's quite significant. So he says, well, you're never going to have a piece that you can serve at a meal, because as soon as you chew it, you can't serve it anymore. So you're throwing away the whole bittul idea, because as soon as you chew it, he says, certainly you can't say that we're talking about, when we look at a creature, we look at something that's ready to be served to a guest, we don't look at it after it's entered your mouth, we look at it before it's entered your mouth. And therefore, he says, we certainly can't rely on this, although he quotes a certain goyin who was in a particular town, and they couldn't get bread which wasn't infested. Very unlucky. They lived in a place that all the bread was infested, and they had a big problem because they wanted to eat bread. And this goyin advised and paskened for them, they should make sure to chew their bread very well, and that way any bugs will now be pulverized, and that way they can eat them. So Baruch Hashem, we don't have that problem. So in conclusion of the fifth point, when you go to Oakberry, when you go to Boost Juice, because somebody else is doing it for you and they're actually unaware of the prohibition to eat bugs, once they blend it together, there won't be a problem, because we can presume it's going to be bottled b'shishim. There isn't that many bugs. There's going to be much more smoothie. That will be okay. To rely on using your mouth, besides for it being quite gross, that is a little bit more controversial.
So if there's a Jewish person serving in Oakberry, is that a problem?
That's a good question. So the question was, what if a Jewish person is serving in Oakberry? I think it still wouldn't be a problem unless they have that intention. So if the Jewish person is intending and knows about the Isser of bugs and they're blending it for you because they know otherwise you can't eat it, then it would be a problem. But if they're entirely unaware, then l'chayr would be okay.
They're also blending it for everybody, not just blending it for
Right.
everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, you mentioned before there was a Rishon that said it was very about 960.
Yeah.
What's the calculation, and does anyone else say that?
It was Rabbeinu Shimshon and the Rashba. They do it, and it's brought in the Rosh in Chulin. It was a little bit complicated, so I didn't want to mention it, but I can give you the Maramokam afterwards. It comes from a Mishnah in Trumas. There's a raya from the Mishnayos. Yeah. Okay. So point number 6. How does this measure up today? There's different times in history where they did care about bugs, they didn't care about bugs. When it comes to bugs, we're coming to the summer holidays now, so I don't think I need to tell everybody, but it depends on climate. During the summer, especially if you go away from the city, the bugs come out in droves. So although in the winter it's usually a little bit calmer, I'm very prone to mosquito bites. In the winter I'm okay. In the summer it's quite uncomfortable. The Pri Chodosh, whose Rabbi Stern will help me, his yard site is this week, right? Today, there you go. Mamash Hashgacha Pratis, I did not plan that. The Pri Chodesh says, everything in Hebrew, he says, it depends. It depends on the time period that you're living in. You know, bugs can spread very rapidly. If anyone's been through Australian customs, they're very pedantic about fruits and vegetables. They don't want any bugs or various pests, etc., to come into the country. For example, I was curious about this, so I Googled this. There's a beetle called the Colorado beetle. It was first discovered in 1824, and it affects specifically potato crops. And back in 1824, it already spread 140 kilometers a year. This is without being imported on boats, without going on planes, etc. That's pretty fast. I hope I don't freak anybody out, but some statistics that I found from Israel. They tested 619 dried fruits and 249 of them were infested. They found in imported chocolate an average of 23 insects in 1 kilo. Apparently the coffee, I mean, there's no surprises with this one, I don't think, but coffee from Africa, 81% was infested. And apparently because of the huge amount of infestation in certain countries, the government regulations allow a significant amount of infestation. So this is what I found. I think it's correct. In Israel, they allow for olives 4% to be infested. Figs, 10% legally is allowed to be infested. Dates, 6 bugs per 60 dates are allowed to be infested. Although we know, of course, that they put on lots of pesticides, right? That was why I was always told that we peel our fruit and vegetables on Pesach, because there's lots of chometz, pesticides. So they do spray, and it is true, they do spray with a lot of pesticides. It only helps for some bugs. It also apparently can sometimes increase other bugs. And today, apparently, more and more they're scaling back on the pesticides because it's not so healthy, and there's a lot of organic produce that you can get that they didn't use pesticides. If pesticides weren't used, it really one needs to check for bugs. There's much more likelihood, obviously, of there being bugs.
All these are visible to the naked eye?
A lot of them are visible to the eye. So there is a guide. This is not a plug for Kosher Australia, but there is a colourful guide that you can get from Kosher Australia, which goes through a lot of produce, as you can see over here, and it tells you exactly what needs to be checked and what doesn't need to be checked and how it should be checked. For those that do the cooking, I don't recommend looking at it because it could make your life much more difficult, but it's quite rigorous, especially things like strawberries and berries, especially. I think most people check lettuce. Interestingly, so when I was trying to figure out why Kosher Australia and KA, there's a bit of a difference. So I went on KA's website, the Sydney Kashrus' website, and they have a fruit and vegetable guide. And I checked the fruit, and it's just fruit. They don't have a separate tab for berries. They say all Australian fruit does not need to be checked. Just a blanket rule, just like that. And again, I'm in no place to disagree with them. I'm just presenting to you the facts. They say that various vegetables do need it, but any Australian fruits, berries, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, all sorts of peaches, etc., don't need to be checked at all. So I thought in Hebrew we call it lishitosoi. So it works very well, the fact that they provide certification to Oakberry, because if it doesn't need to be checked for bugs, as we said, there's no issue with the milk. The only issue would be the bugs, and there are no bugs in Australian fruit, and therefore it would be okay. However, Kosher Australia does require one to check his strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, and what else? I'm just looking at this list over here very quickly. Figs, etc. They all need to be checked, and therefore it may be a little bit of an issue. So, as we mentioned before, anything which is blended won't be an issue. However, anyone that's been to Oakberry, they blend a specific drink, and then on the top, they put some cut up strawberries or blueberries or whatever you request, really. That is where we're going to have a little bit of an issue if it needs to be checked. So, doesn't the company check, or don't the people serving you check? They do check. However, The only person that's allowed to check is a man or a woman that's over bar or bas mitzvah, and they have to be Jewish. We cannot trust, as it's mentioned, and we've mentioned before, and we'll mention it soon again, the Ramah says we do not rely on a non-Jew or a Jewish person who we can't trust when it comes to checking for bugs. So, just to conclude about oakberry and boost juice. And again, don't take my word, make your own inquiries and ask a Rav. But boost juice, which to the best of my knowledge, they blend everything, you won't have so much of a problem, because as we said, it's all going to become nullified. It's not being done for that purpose, so it should be okay. However, in oakberry, where not everything is blended, they cut up some fruit on the top, it would probably be best, if it's one of the fruits that need to be checked, to check it yourself. So you can technically buy a smoothie and take off the fruit and check it yourself, put it under water, etc. You can request for no fruit on top. That would also be okay, but it is something to keep in mind. Okay, so just to summarize, and then we'll move on to the vegan establishments. We spoke about bugs, how severe the prohibition is, that you have to check them, when you have to check them, how hard one has to look. We said you don't need a microscope. We said although there are some that want to say if you're not intending to eat the bugs, it would be okay. We said most people disagree with that. We said that the bugs do become bottled if they are blended. And we spoke about how things change based on the climate, location, and times, which is very important. When my wife, I do have to mention my wife is here, she was the inspiration for this share, because she was reminiscing her days in Montreal Seminary where they were not allowed to eat strawberries. They weren't allowed to eat strawberries, and any vegetables or various fruits that it had to come with a hechsher. Yeah, it's good for the Jewish companies. They just rebrand the fruit. So, because this overlaps, I just wanted to speak with the last few minutes. We still have a little bit of time about what about strictly vegan restaurants, because the two topics do overlap quite a little bit. So, just like oakberry and Boost Juice has no kosher certification, but it technically doesn't need kosher certification because there's no non-kosher products. What about a vegan restaurant, right? Lord of the Fries, for example, right, which is a vegan restaurant in Australia, and there are others. There's no what could be non-kosher about them? There's no animal products. They just have fruits and vegetables. What could possibly be the problem? Perhaps also one could suggest that they should be able to be kosher without kosher certification. So I want to discuss 4 points. 2 of them we've already touched on. 2 of them we're going to explore a little bit. Number 1, is it really all kosher? Secondly, the issue of bishul akum, the fact that the food is being cooked by a non-Jew. Thirdly, and this is the issue we just discussed at length, the bugs. And number 4, can we trust the non-Jew? So, in terms of the kashrus of the food, so let's just imagine we're talking about a strictly vegan restaurant. So not one with vegan options. You certainly can't go to a restaurant which offers a vegan option, but they cook it with all the other foods, etc. Even if it is strictly vegan, can we trust that it is? And also another major issue, which I think a lot of people are aware of, is the vinegar. So I was reading an article that appears in a Torah journal called Tchumen, where this professor, he is a modern Orthodox professor, his name is Professor Fixler, wants to use the heter of Ramosha, which Rabbi Dickstein mentioned about Cholav Yisrael. So Ramosha says that we can trust the government regulations and that there's no non-kosher milk mixed in with milk. And Professor Fixler, wants to use the same reasoning, and he says that the vegan hechsherim are quite strict. It's quite funny because it's a lot of halachic concepts. So there's 3 main vegan hechsherim. I guess you have the OUOK or CRC. So they have Bio Agrisert, Brewdog, and Expertise Vegan. I think Brewdog, at least I've seen when I looked at these hechsherim symbols, they're very, very common. And he says they do surprise visits, like also Kosher Australia, they'll walk into a restaurant, and he says it's really quite strict. But aside from the fact, and Rabbi Dickstein mentioned this, that Ramosha's heter was b'diavad, you can't rely on it l'chatchila. You have another, even if we assume that everything is strictly vegan, vinegar is vegan. Vinegar can come from wine, and although it's completely vegan, we know we don't have any yayin nesach. So any wine which wasn't boiled and has been touched by someone that's not Jewish is absolutely forbidden. And if they use vinegar, therefore, and why shouldn't they use vinegar in their foods, that creates a major problem for us. So Professor Fixler wants to suggest that you can go to a vegan restaurant and say, I'm allergic to vinegar, or I really don't want vinegar in my food, and try and rely on that. But of course it's going to cause problems, not just in trusting them that they didn't put in your food, but that they've used the same vessels and ovens and pots for the vinegar. And that will definitely be a major issue. The third point is, and I found this fascinating, and you can check it up for yourselves, I checked it up, the vegan societies. If you go on the official vegan society website, it says, and I quote, that cross-contamination should be avoided by taking reasonable, practical steps. And ideally, if you're going to do a cook vegan and non-vegan, you should do the vegan run first, ideally. So they're not so strict, certainly not as strict as we would be in halacha, and they'd use the same vessels for vegan and not vegan, so they may use animal products and cook animals in pots, and then you afterwards cook vegan food. So we certainly can't rely that it's 100% kosher. Secondly, as we mentioned, there's an issue of bishul akum. We know, and just very quickly, because I think it's been mentioned in a couple of shiurim, we don't have anything, even if it's 100% kosher, all the ingredients are kosher, it has to be cooked by a Jewish person. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah says there are two reasons for this. Number one, because it might lead to intermarriage. And secondly, they may put in something which is not kosher. We are concerned that they'll put in something non-kosher. There are two exceptions to this, and that is if it's normally eaten raw. So for example, apples are normally eaten raw, and therefore applesauce does not have to be cooked by a Jew. Or if it's not significant enough to be served at a king's table. So, for example, although this is a little bit controversial, potato chips wouldn't be served, I would assume, at a king's table, and therefore they don't need to be bishul yisrael. So, is there anything in a vegan restaurant that would need to be cooked by a Jew? So there was a famous Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, who says quite a big chiddush, and he says the lashon, the terminology of the Gemara is anything that's oidla al shulchan malachim lalafis es hapas. What needs to be cooked by a Jew? And only something which you would spread it on bread. If it would be spread on bread, then it needs to be cooked by a Jew. So Professor Fixler, which we mentioned before, somehow I tried to work out, and I'm sure he's certainly much more intelligent and knowledgeable than me, interprets this and says that anything without bread will have an issue of bishul, being bishul akum, otherwise it won't. And so if it's not, he says if it's satiating, then it will be a problem. If it's not completely satiating, then it's going to be fine. And he concludes, since in a vegan restaurant nothing's satiating, that I agree with, so therefore it's not going to be. Therefore, there's going to be no issue. Even if they cooked rice and vegan pasta, etc., it will be fine. However, obviously, Reb Zev Weizmann, who's a rav there's a big company in Israel called Tnuva. They make a lot of milchik products. He is their official rav, and he says that first of all, what Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin was saying was that anything eaten with bread is a problem. If not, it's not a problem, which is quite mechudesh in its own. He's basically saying that hummus, tuna, and avocado dip needs to be bishul yisrael, whereas meat and fish and all these things that we presume need to be cooked by a Jew don't need to be. And also that Professor Fixler completely misinterpreted what he was saying. So I thought that was very interesting. First time I've come across this. Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin was a big rav. He wasn't just a person. But according to him, only hummus and tuna needs to be bishul yisrael. So that's number one. Number two, which I found fascinating as well, the Shulchan Aruch talks about a dish called hersana. It actually comes from the Gemara, which is fish brine, which is mixed with flour. And it says if the main thing is the flour, then it needs to be bishul yisrael, because flour needs to be bishul yisrael. Similarly, if anyone's been to Sufrin Hill, they make those candies right in the old place. Always wanted one, but they make them together with flour. They're always putting flour. If the main thing is the flour, then it needs to be bishul yisrael. It goes by roiv. What's the majority? So Professor Fixler wants to say if you go to a vegan restaurant and majority of the dish that you're having doesn't need to be bishul yisrael, then it's okay to eat. If majority does, then it will need to be. But again, Reb Zev Weizmann argues, and he says that din of going by majority is only applicable to things which cannot be separated. You cannot separate once you've mixed the candy for example, you can't separate the two. If you've glazed bread with egg, you can't separate the two. But if you go to a vegan restaurant, you're having a salad, a quinoa salad, or whatever it is, you can easily separate the things that need to be cooked by a Jew and the things that don't need to be cooked by a Jew, and therefore, he says it's going to be a problem. Just being mindful of the time, we might cut it a little bit short. Just something interesting that I found, and I think it's discussed in general when talking about the topic of Bishul Yisrael. What about workers in the store? Professor Fixler wants to say it's quite unlikely, in fact impossible, that you're going to establish a relationship, which is the reason for the prohibition of Bishul Yisrael, with the chef that's in the kitchen who you don't even see. And he wants to separate, he wants to say, if it's the person, if you go to a non-Jew's house and they're making food in their kitchen and they give it to you, okay, that makes sense to prohibit. But if it's someone that's just in the kitchen that you don't even see, that should be fine. And he brings a proof from what the Shulchan Aruch talks about is shvachos, maidservants, that the Ramah seems to permit and say that if a maidservant made you food, it's going to be fine. And the Taz and Shach bring this, and they bring a source for it. It comes from the Rabbi and the Torah, and he says there's no kiruv adas, there's no connection whatsoever between someone that's cooking in the kitchen and you, especially if you hire someone, if you have a cook in your house and you're paying them, right? Certainly they're not doing it to start a relationship. However, both the Taz and the Shach don't rely on this, and they say it will still be a problem. And if we just zoom out for a second, if you follow that opinion, there will only be a problem of Bishul Yisrael if you're invited to a non-Jew's house and they cook for you and they're serving it in front of you. But any other restaurant, there won't be an issue. Just very quickly, the third point about bugs will still be an issue. We don't trust non-Jews to check for bugs, and therefore if you go to a vegan restaurant and you order a salad, the lettuce wasn't checked by a Jew and will be a problem. And fourthly, we don't trust non-Jews, and you have to trust over here the non-Jew that they didn't put vinegar in their food, they checked for bugs, etc. And therefore, all in all, it would definitely be a major problem to eat at a vegan establishment. So, just to summarize, and then we'll hand over the mic to Rabbi Jax. We spoke about oakberry, the issue of the milk, which we said can be easily avoided. We spoke about bugs, and how if it's blended, it's not so much of an issue, but if it's cut up, it may be an issue. Then we spoke about vegan restaurants, we spoke about bugs, kashrus, bishul, and ne'emonus. We'll just conclude the same way that the Rebbe concluded his Sikha on Tafshin Lamed Hey, that hopefully by being more careful with kashrus will make the world a more pure place, and ultimately we will be zocher to Mashiach.